Um, so what this book talks about when it discusses the game of school is that there are rules and there is a system to the way school is played. And just like any other game, if you know the rules or kind of can figure them out or can figure out the strategy that other people are using, then you can be more successful than if you're going about things and just haphazardly, um, have to go back to the beginning and pay $200, right? And so there's some students, when we think about our schools, and if you think about your adult learners, that when they were having their K-12 experiences, they knew the rules of the game, but then there were some that weren't, right? So if you think about what are the rules to be successful in a K-12 typical school environment, it would be things like being compliant, listening, staying in your seats, like following directions, complete what is asked of you on time and as assigned. Um, and so if we think about who is in this game, it's all of us, right? As educators, sometimes if we're parents of students. But what we need to know about the game of school is that it is not relevant or realistic when we think about or related to the game of life, right? So in life, if we think about what skills we want for individuals to be successful in their work, in their relationships, and living independently and contributing to society, a lot of it is not just be compliant, listen, do what you're told, right? We want people to take in the information from the world around them, critically evaluate it against their goals, their values, and then make informed decisions, right? So we want them to feel like they have that external locus of control, right? That they can be self-determined and know what it takes to influence their lives versus having life happen to them and not being aware of the rules for the game of school. And so this concept has been around for a long time. So this is a screenshot of a older journal article from 1972. And it's a classic because you can see the subtitle is "Be Still, Be Quiet, Be Docile," right? And so it talks in this article, which it's still good. You can get it, search it for free on the internet. And it's a review of papers that show that really when we think about people with inappropriate behavior versus those with appropriate behavior, we just wanted them to be still, be quiet, be docile. But are we really preparing them for that game of work? And are we making everybody aware of explicitly what the rules are? Does everybody have the skills that they need to actually be successful in their learning environment? And so we need to think about then what our assumptions and beliefs are about school, about learning, about our students, about our roles as educators and students learning. Um, and so Dave Eddyburn, who is well-known, he's a special ed professor, but his focus is educational technology and UDL. And so he frames this as this assumption or belief on the part of schools that people need to be nakedly independent, not independent naked, right? But have this assumption that in order for you to be successful, you're going to meet this standard and you need to be able to do that independently. That having some sort of accommodation or modifications, that everybody should be held to the same standard and achieve the same thing at the same rate, at the same time, in the same way. I don't think that that's probably the view that we have in this audience, just because of the learners that we work with. But sometimes we may still have this, not be aware of this bias that we have, right? And it's honestly, it's ridiculous as saying, remove your glasses to be fair to everybody. So it's this concept we know that fair doesn't mean equal, right? That's actually another great book, Fair Isn't Equal. And so some of you have probably seen this figure before, or some version of it. right? So this is what some people think should be the role of the school system and the role of teachers is to make sure that things are equal, so that everyone gets the same thing, not showing preference to one group over another, or one student over another. As you can see here, this figure has 3 humanoid figures, one depicting an adult, one maybe an adolescent, and one a child. And they all 3 have the same size box to look over the fence. But that box is not adequate for the shorter student, right? And so then some people think, well, all right, if maybe they don't need things that are equal, maybe we need something that is equitable, that people are getting what they need in order to have access to the same thing. It's moving in the right direction, right? So we can see here that it is a lot easier. And this, the green figure has better access, can see well, and that we may have actually found out that like the blue person didn't need a box at all. They can see just fine without it. And then you can see the purple person, maybe they prefer a ladder instead of a box. It's going to achieve the same thing, but maybe it's more stable. They have something to hold on to. And so then I have seen this depiction, right, where the thought is, well, why is there a fence at all? Why is it a wooden fence? If we just took away the wooden fence and put a chain link fence, then nobody needs anything to stand on, right? So that's the example of changing the environment so that we don't have to adjust for the individuals, right? Which is, if you've attended the prior webinars, is something that we have talked about, is how can we take a look not only at what individuals might need to support them, whether that's an accommodation or specific instruction and a skill set that they don't have, but then we can also look at the environment. Are there barriers there that don't need to be? For example, can we have a fence that you can see through? But then if we look at this last video, it's not going to want me to do this. This should be where we are headed, that it's not just that everyone has an environment that's conducive to their goals, but that actually everybody has the opportunity to be engaged, right? So people who look at this third picture might think, well, why is there a fence? Why aren't these individuals being able to play if they want to? Certainly don't make everyone play. Like I was that kid in PE who was like, please don't make me. I do not like forced cheerfulness. I want to be able to play if I want to. And so in this fourth figure, you see that there's no fence, everyone plays, and the 3 people are able to enjoy the game. 2 are involved. They've been given roles that they enjoy and that they were able to choose. It benefits the whole team, and someone's able to just watch if they want to. So this is an example of how we can look at what our maybe implicit assumptions are about what an individual needs, what is happening in the environment, and how can we like really, not to have a bad pun, go outside the box of making sure that we're meeting everybody's needs. So in order to become aware of our assumptions, what those assumptions are and what those beliefs are, obviously everything is not quite as simple as a cartoon of a baseball game. We need to sort of look at, well, what do I think and believe, and why? Why am I, what has formed this paradigm or formed these expectations? And so there's a concept I want to introduce, or you may be familiar with it, called the illusory truth effect. So it's a psychological phenomena where what we see, we are familiar with, we're more likely to believe. So I love this quote that says, objective truth is less important than familiarity. I don't actually mean that. It's not actually less important. I mean, when your brain prioritizes what it remembers, we tend to remember and latch onto the things that are repeated sufficiently often. And so that's what can be the harm sometimes in, adolescents' overconsumption of social media, what type of messages we're exposing each other to, because we start to just make assumptions because we've heard something a lot. We assume it's happening, and then we get the confirmation bias, right? So I got a new car recently, and now I see those cars everywhere, right? Or that phenomenon, if you are looking for an orange car, you'll see orange cars. And so, but what leads to that confirmation bias is that illusory truth effect. And that applies to how we think about and talk about our learners in our classrooms too. How we, maybe they've been with someone else, or you had, you read records or talked to the instructors that were there before, and we kind of make these assumptions just because of the things that we have heard and not necessarily objective truth that we've been told. So this is the ladder of truths. And so we take in, information in the world. We are constantly bombarded with sensory information. I can see things, I can hear things, I can feel things, I can smell things. I am very sensitive to smells and to sounds. It's funny because I can be in a loud coffee shop and then it's like there's so many sounds that it's fine, I can pay attention. But if I am somewhere, I was at a conference last week in Clearwater, and the fluorescent light bulb was like buzzing really loud, and I almost couldn't stand it. I could not stop thinking about it, right? So we take in information in the world, whether that's sensory information or in having conversations and experiences with other people. And then your brain is only going to select data from what you observe. We can't take and hold everything in. I wish I could tell my brain to ignore the buzzing lights. And then we take that data and our brain tries to make meaning of it, right? That's called our mental schemas. Schemas are like baskets or a filing system. So your brain takes in information and then it tries to match that information, that experience with what you've done before. Maybe with a prior student you've had, a different book you've read, a movie you've seen. And that's a good thing, right? That's the benefit of that is we see patterns. We need that for word problem solving, for text comprehension, for making inferences, for learning language, right? So you make meaning, and then those meanings lead to assumptions, and the assumptions lead to conclusions, and then those conclusions lead to your beliefs, and we act in alignment with our beliefs. Right. And so this is just the way that our brains take in and process information. So I want to tell you a story to give you an example of how this can work to our disadvantage. Okay, so Jane arranged to go meet with Mary for coffee, and they decided that they were going to meet there at 10:30 a.m. But Mary's late, and she didn't explain why she was late. In fact, when she got there, she didn't even say anything to Jane. She just came right in and sat down and didn't say anything. Jane decides that because Mary didn't even say anything, she showed up late, then she just simply couldn't be bothered to come on time. She couldn't be bothered to stop whatever she was doing before to make sure she, left and took time for traffic and all of that. And so her assumption then is that Mary values her own time more than she values her own. And so then Jane makes a conclusion that it's not worth bothering to meet up with her in the future because obviously Mary doesn't want to see her. She would have prioritized her, which prioritizing her would have meant coming on time or acknowledging her tardiness. So then when Mary, a few weeks later, suggests getting coffee again, Jane makes an excuse and doesn't do it. So at the end of all of this, Mary sees that Jane doesn't want to meet up with her again, and she has no idea why. There could be any number of reasons that she was late, but Jane didn't ask. And then Mary just makes this assumption that Jane decided the friendship isn't worth pursuing. So this is obviously like a very simplistic example, but I hope that you could see how that we can take something that someone does and then we like extrapolate it, and we extrapolate based on our own values. based on our own meanings. So if Jane is coming from a very Western centric, specifically American viewpoint of, timeliness is important. I was raised this way, that like being late is rude. And then you are inconveniencing others. And tell you, in the South, that was like the worst thing that a female could do, is be rude or inconvenience someone else. And so I can understand that very strong reaction. Whereas if Mary is coming from a culture where like time is an estimation, it's an about, it's more important to be doing what you are doing and enjoy it, than to rush to the next thing. And so Jane has assigned some meaning and assumptions and then actions that are false, and then a friendship is lost. And so I think that as teachers, we do this also. We, as K-12 teachers, I know that, interacting with families is really important, and we can make assumptions about families based on what we see them doing. And then I think that we do this with adult learners too. So it's important that we're aware of, how our brain confirms things, that it sees repeated, about how we draw meaning and make assumptions about the actions of others based on our own values and experiences. But we can't just stop with the awareness. Awareness it only gets you so far. What we want to do is adjust our teaching instructional practices. And so if we were doing this in person, I would give you all rubber bands. That's my favorite illustration of this. And there's this quote that says, when practices change without deep exploration of the principles that guide them, people will be pulled back into their own ways, right? So let's think you get like a fresh new rubber band. I can almost like smell what that box would smell like. And all of a sudden you want to stretch it out and make it really big instead of small. Well, if you just do that immediately, as soon as you let go, it's going to immediately snap back, right? That we can't make these giant big changes in our beliefs and in our assumptions, which in our practices, right? Because changing our practices, we have to change the way we think about and make decisions. We can't just do a whole bunch at one time. So as human beings, we stretch out as well. And when we stretch, it creates tension and pressure, right? There's something called cognitive dissonance, when like you learn something new, but it doesn't match with your prior assumptions or experiences. And there's that rub between them, right? That has to be resolved. And so we do the same thing, that if we try to all of a sudden completely change our instructional practices and do this huge overhaul, it's not going to work, just like it wouldn't for any other human behavior of like, all of a sudden I'm going to work out every morning, or all of a sudden I'm going to drastically change my diet and only drink water, right? That doesn't work. So this is what we mean by you need to be resilient, because we don't want to stretch so far that we break, but also be realistic. Of course, we've all experienced a time where we've pulled and stretched it so that it has snapped. We don't want to do that. And so I encourage you, as we go through today's webinar and then the subsequent ones, when we get into talking about instructional strategies. So that the past two, I've been trying to build your sort of knowledge base. And then now we're really going to start to build in some strategies, but it is important that you understand the principles that guide and inform these strategies, because then you're going to be able to make better decisions about when to use what. And then also you're not going to stretch and snap back. But I think we also need to be aware that our students and our colleagues also are, taking in information and going up the ladder with it. And our students are also, and colleagues, that if we are trying to change things and grow, we need to be careful not to do it too quickly, right? If you just stretch the rubber band a little bit at a time, then it's going to be able to accomplish what you want. Our students have assumptions and beliefs about themselves, about the purpose of school, the way school works, many adult learners had negative experiences in K-12 schools. And so they may have some very firm assumptions and beliefs. And so when they take in actions that they perceive as being picked on or being singled out, um, you might get a different response than someone who didn't have that past experience. I think our students notice our assumptions and beliefs, and if they don't align with our actions, right? So if we don't practice what we preach, and that our learning environments can encourage students to express their needs, to express their beliefs, and to safely explore those things. In our talking about people with disabilities, our focus is not primarily, but a big piece of this is neurodiversity. And so us thinking that, disabilities aren't only physical, but we can have different ways of experiencing the world. And so when we talk about neurodiversity, I'm talking about things related to the nervous system, to the brain, and then diverse just meaning differences, right? So a great deal of variety. And so neurodiversity is this view that there are differences in our brains, and that is normal. And by normal, I mean typical. It's expected. It's not totally outside the norm. And as I'll talk about, there's actually no such thing as normal or average. And these differences don't need to be seen as weaknesses. They don't need to be fixed or cured, but they are just a variation of the human brain. Now, we do need to make sure that we are accounting for and supporting those differences in our classes. And so when we think about neurodiversity, that means if there's a lot of differences, we are talking about everybody, and everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Function and development and competency are totally on a continuum, depending on the context you're in, and the culture you're in. And so we can try to sort of reframe, instead of saying like maybe disordered behavior or disordered thinking, but that it's just a different type of order, to normalize it, have it. But with that being said, the concept of neurodiversity does not replace disability. We can use the words diagnosis and disability, not just can, should, they're facts. There's benefits to that, like getting protections under the law, right? If you have an identified disability, then the ADA says that the workplace and public buildings need to be accessible. If you have the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is going to protect the right to, you to have an accommodation on the GED. So it gives people protections and rights. It helps us to tailor our instructional strategies, because if we kind of know what some common characteristics of that behavior are, or that disability, then we can proactively support it. And for some individuals, this might be a part of their identity. So in the deaf culture, there's a whole sort of movement of self-advocates that are autistic adults that really identify with autism being a part of their identity, and they prefer to be called autistic. That's not everyone, though. Not everyone sees their disability as something that they want to share with everyone. So it is possible for neurodiversity and disability to coexist. I don't want you to think that it means we don't say disability anymore. They're two different things. So I consider myself neurodiverse, been diagnosed with ADHD, but I don't really consider myself to have a disability. I just think the way my brain processes things and what it prioritizes, and what I find interesting and important in my ability to hyperfocus is different from how a lot of other people approach working and living and teaching. But it is not disabling to me, at least right now. So then I want to talk about an instructional strategy that we can use to help us to consider all these various learning needs of students, and consider their assumptions and beliefs and our assumptions and beliefs, which probably feels like a really big ask. right? And so you might be saying, why do you have pictures of food up here right now? And that's because I love to use a analogy to describe what UDL can be in the classroom. So let's say I'm going to have a dinner party at my house. My husband is a really good cook. I am so lucky in that regard. And one of the things that he's really good at making is pasta. He can make homemade noodles. We don't do that often, but he does make homemade sauce. He's Irish, but we had a really close friend who was a elderly Italian man who taught him how to make homemade sauce. So it makes the house smell so good, right? And then we pour it over the noodles. And my favorite thing is we put the mozzarella cheese on top and bake it under the broiler. And then I feel like we have to have something green on the table. So I really like spinach salads. I love goat cheese and walnuts and cranberries. And then, might have some bread with some butter on it, garlic. So these are the things that I'm going to serve because they're things that I like and I'm good at. And it meets everybody's food groups. It's not like I'm just serving bread, but then I realized that I'm going to have people come over who one person has celiac disease. So maybe they'll just like have a salad and they can pull out the meat and we have some meatballs in there. And then we're going to have somebody who's vegan. So maybe she can just have noodles and like melt some butter on top. She can't even have the sauce. And then bread. I'm sure she loves bread. And maybe she can just get some of the salad that doesn't have cheese on it. I have another friend who is going to be bringing her daughter who only eats dinosaur chicken nuggets and peanut butter and jelly. And so I already knew that she was coming, and I keep those dinosaur chicken nuggets in the freezer at all times to be ready for her. And then finally, my husband, in fact, does not eat pasta, right? And so he is already prepared to just have meat on the side and his salad. So I chose to plan this meal and chose the menu based on things that I'm good at and I like. I've got it all planned and ready. I do know I'm going to have this other, child coming. And so I knew I wasn't going to have, they weren't going to eat this. So I do have that thing for them. This feels like, this is similar to traditional instruction, where we have something that needs to be accomplished, like going to have a dinner party, going to work on reading comprehension, or going to work on math word problem solving. And we use the strategies that we are familiar with, that we're comfortable with, that we're good at, meet our teaching styles, because we each have different ways we prefer and like to teach. That's what makes things interesting. But if we approach instruction this way of I've planned the menu, I'm meeting the standards or the competencies or the skills that I want, I'm going to do it with the way that I feel comfortable. And then we think about who's coming to dinner, or then we think about the needs of the different learners. We're going to have somebody who just eats bread, right? And would you say that that's really the experience you wanted them to have? Did they get everything out of it? No. But also in the moment, making sure like, oh, okay, I can, let me get some gluten-free pasta out for you. And then, I'll make the second salad and I have a jar of sauce, that's what some people see as differentiation. And it is seen like being a short order cook, and it's not sustainable. And maybe they're like, oh, well, I knew I had this person. I had, the dinosaur chicken nuggets ready for them. But that seems overwhelming. And as the instructor and the people in the classroom, you're not enjoying it. That's stressful. And so you can think of this traditional instruction as static. When we see student progress, what we're really measuring is the effectiveness of a curriculum, not student learning. It's very lockstep following a pre-designed plan. And I don't think anybody here or many people who stay in education long truly do that traditional instruction as described here. What's more common, because teachers have this need and this desire to meet the needs of the students that they have in the classroom, is differentiation. And so it is not static, but it's reactive in it's evaluating just the student, and it's just considering the student's needs. It's very like cause and effect of like, oh, now I see that you're having trouble. Let me go ahead and adjust instruction now on the fly. I want to present UDL, Universal Design for Learning, as an alternative. So instead of being reactive of, in the fly, on the fly, trying to make adjustments, we're going to go ahead and plan for who's coming to dinner, who's in our classroom, and basing our menu, our instruction on those needs. So how can we feasibly and efficiently meet the needs of everybody, and also make sure that we're supporting the things that we know from brain research help make learning the most efficient and the most effective. So UDL is intentional. Instruction is designed before before students are there, and it's a framework for making instructional decisions. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't any adjustment in the moment. That is being a good teacher. That's where like the art and the science sometimes divide, when you just kind of know, oh, let me give this other example, or let me explain it this way. We're still going to do that. But the more that we can proactively plan for the students in our class and thinking about what do we know about them, not saying that we have to make everything universal accessible to the universe of possibilities of students. You know who you have, and get to know them, and we incorporate that into our instructional planning. So I want to be really clear with what UDL is and what it is not. It is not a prescription. So it needs to be mixed and matched according to the specific learning goals. Sometimes when I get into like the nitty-gritty details of the components of UDL, people feel overwhelmed and like, well, that's not feasible either. And so I'm going to go ahead and want you to be thinking about UDL as a framework. Many of the techniques and strategies and considerations, I'm sure, are going to be familiar to things that you use currently or have used. So it's not necessarily that the strategies are different, it's the way that we think about them and the way that we plan for them and select them. So it's a framework that helps us give a shared language for instructional design. So the best place to learn about UDL, I would say, is CAST, C-A-S-T. And so I think it's cast.org, if it's the website. It's a federally funded technical assistance project. And they are all about UDL, accessibility, and technology. Thank you very much, Vivian, for adding that into the chat. And so UDL is based on the way that our brains process information and make decisions. So there are three networks in the brain that it draws on. One is the affective network, or the Y. So when we think about the affective network aspects of instruction, we want to think about how can we get students interested and motivate them for learning. This is especially true for individuals with disabilities or who have had a history of not great school experiences. I'm not saying that it has to be this like capital T trauma that they had in school, but just like it hasn't gone well. And so we need to make sure that we are using strategies to keep them interested, motivated, engaged, show how something is relevant in the real world, but and then also maintain persistence, right? So that when things get difficult, they keep trying. The second network is the recognition network, and that's the content that we're actually learning. And so when we are thinking about designing instruction to be considerate of our students' recognition networks, we're thinking about how do we present information? What information do we present, in what order, and is it accessible to students? And then the third network is the strategic network, or the how. So how are we going to make sure that the students can show what they know? So we know that there's no average brain. There's an excellent TED Talk, I think it's a little over 20 minutes, called The Myth of Average. Highly recommend it. It's fascinating. I'm gonna give some examples in a bit that's pulled from that talk, but if you enjoy listening to such things, I recommend you look it up. And what it talks about is there's no average, because we know how we get to average is flawed. So what we know about our brains is that variability is the dominant feature. So the most thing we have in common is that we're different. Variability, though, is predictable. And the way that we differ is based on these three networks. Understanding and planning for neurovariability is important because there's no such thing as learning styles. So learning styles are not supported with research. There's been no evidence at all. In fact, any study that's been done has shown that that theory of some of us we learn best in a certain mode. So there's many different like flavors of learning styles. One common one is kinesthetic learners need to have something hands-on, and visual learners need to like see it happen or get written instructions, and auditory learners work best if they just get that information by listening to it. It makes sense of why this myth holds true. One, the illusory effect of truth. So the things that we see all the time. I've been in districts where that's on their lesson plan template, learning styles. Until recently, I believe it was on the elementary teachers exam in Florida. My university sends out emails from the Center on Teaching on how to adjust to learning styles. I send them an email. But why this seems to hold true is, if we think about each of us, I have ways that I prefer to learn, right? So thinking about my own neurodiversity, when, let's say I'm in a hotel right now in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to need to go find like a CVS or something nearby. So if I go downstairs and I ask the bellman, he's going to tell me, I'm not going to remember any of it. I'm going to have to ask him to do it again, or I'm going to have to write it down. I cannot hold that like step-by-step verbal information in my brain. That's but that doesn't mean that I can't learn information by listening, right? So I did a lot of music training as a child and teenager. And so I couldn't just read something and know like how to sing the tune, right? So there are some learning activities where we can really consider students' preferences, what engages them, what are barriers for them, but it doesn't mean that that's their specific learning style. But the motivation behind these comes from a good place. We recognize that people are different. And as teachers, we want our students to get the most out of instruction that they can. And this kind of on the surface seems to make sense. But I hope that you can see how UDL can accomplish that goal. So as we've talked about assumptions and beliefs, I think it's really important that I outline the assumptions and beliefs of UDL. So this framework is based on 6 assumptions and beliefs. One, and this is something I think we've talked about twice at least already, is that disability is often a construct of design, right? So it is often about the mismatch between the individual's personal competence and the demands of the environment. And so we don't only blame the individual thinking, well, they just need more skills. And we also don't blame the environment and think, well, if the environment was just more accessible, then I would be successful. It's somewhere in the middle, right? We think about, can we remove the fence? Why is the fence there? Can it be removed? And sometimes the fences can't be removed. The fence needs to be there. So we give them some boxes or a ladder. So the second assumption is that barriers to learning are embedded and layered. It is not that simple. It's not simple as, oh, the barriers is the fence, so I'll just remove the fence, right? That's just an illustration. And so based on Stephen Covey's work, so if you're familiar with the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, that's Stephen Covey. He talked about these circles. So there are things that we can be concerned about, things that we notice in ourselves, in our families, in our students that we are concerned about. But some of those things we have absolutely no control over. Like I can't directly influence it. There are some things that I can directly influence, right? And then excuse me, directly control. And then there are things that we can influence. And so when you start to think about the barriers your students are experiencing or could experience when you consider what content or skills you need them to learn, this is a way to sort of separate it out, right? Are there things that I can definitely control this aspect, right? So my student is not able to read fluently. And so to teach this comprehension strategy, I'm going to read it out loud, or it's going to be a digital text that they can listen to on the computer in the classroom. So I can directly control that. There may be things that I can just influence, right? Like a student has a really hard time persevering through a difficult task. I can't make them. There's a lot of things you can't make people do, but I can influence it. I can look at strategies to teach them and to help motivate them to persevere. And there are some things that like you absolutely just can't do anything about. So it's just a concern, right? A lot of that can be with your students' environmental situations, family situations, reliable transportation. In some cases, maybe that's something you could influence or control, but in sometimes it's not. And so I'm very much a problem solver, and this fits very much into my thought of like, is this something I can do something about or not? Because if it's not, I'm going to stop putting emotional energy towards that. So the fourth assumption is that, or belief, this is a belief rather, is that we need to separate the learning goals from the skill goals. Okay, so if you look at, I'm going to make this bigger so it's easier to read. Looking at these two pictures as if these are two goals or learning objectives for a class, right? So the first says the student will present a 3-minute speech on the importance of a national railway to Canada's development as a nation. Okay, well, in blue, we have the skill. Being able to give a 3-minute speech, being able to communicate orally is a really important skill that will prepare, especially depending on what someone's job hopes are, that they may need to have that oral communication skills. But that is distinctly different from learning about this like historical concept. And so I would say that if you know that giving speeches, planning speeches, talking in front of people is difficult, we don't want to pair two difficult tasks together. That is going to overwhelm our cognitive load and it's not going to make us feel comfortable in the classroom. It's going to increase the anxiety. Similarly, looking at the second one, there's the prompt to the students to express their understanding of the Civil War in a 5-paragraph essay. Writing an essay is a skill. Understanding the Civil War is a concept. And if that is new, if like we just are starting to understand and learn about the Civil War, then we shouldn't pair that with a skill that is difficult, right? So it's this belief is that we set students up for success by like really honing in on what we do want to work on, and then maybe alleviating the pressure on some of the other things. So then number 5 is that learners need options and choice, whether they are 3, like my daughter, or if they're, an adult. Everyone wants the perception of control. And so I like this graphic because it looks at how the different aspects that we can provide students control over. So different ways to self-regulate. How are they going to show what they know? Okay. And then the 5th one is that variability is expected and normal. So this is very similar to that myth of normal TED Talk that I mentioned. And you can see here, when we give a cognitive achievement or ability test, something like an IQ test, even a academic achievement test, Everyone has these we call jagged profiles, meaning you most often, no one is going to be high on similarities and vocabulary and knowledge and matrix reasoning. Okay. And so we have these two students with these jagged profiles. We can see where the things that they are more, uh, have higher performance in, like this person on the left has higher performance in block design and symbol searching, but not in similarities, right? And then you see this jagged profile of the person on the right. And we use those two things to get an average. And we then assume that average is the goal or the norm when it is not. So we want to embrace that and expect that variability and not see it as like a deficit or something that's abnormal. And finally, it's that the learners have a right to develop expertise, that no one needs to earn the ability to receive high quality instruction. Everybody deserves it. So there's no buts. There's no like everybody deserves it except this person. When you're using the UDL framework to plan, you are thinking about all of your learners with the goal for everyone to be as accessible as possible. So there's some common myths related to the brain and UDL. So one is that, especially as I present, the strategies, and you're like, yeah, I know that. That's just good teaching. Like, well, it is good teaching, but that kind of dismisses the effort that needs to be put into instructional design. So it's more than just good teaching. It's also not the same as differentiated instruction. What it on its surface, it is giving multiple means of the what, how, and why, right? So often when people talk about UDL, they'll say multiple means of representation, multiple means of expression. And it is that's a good start. But like everything, it's not that simple. It's not just making sure things are accessible. Things have to be accessible. You can have an accessible classroom without using UDL. And it's not only about options and choice. That's a piece of it. UDL has layers. So we have sort of this big picture that I've talked about so far about the science behind the why, what, and how of learning. And so as educators, we develop expertise. Education is a professional skill. I consider myself an education scientist. Everyone can't just do this and shouldn't. It does take content area expertise and practice and growing, right? So first with UDL, you have to have this solid background of understanding like how learning works. And then within that, you're making decisions about those three principles. So you're sort of navigating that. How can I make sure the student's engaged? How do I make sure they can show what they know? And how can I make sure that I am teaching the content that they need when they need it? So to kind of loop back around to these aspects of the brain, the strategic, this is how we take in information. So first, any sensory information is received in the back of your brain, and that includes your occipital and temporal lobes. So that's the what. So what I'm learning is going to come right in, and then I am going to be able to process it. And so that processing, whether I take in the stimuli in my environment, what someone's saying, or what I need to do, listening to directions, that is directly related to my motivation and engagement, and like how much I care. Right. So when we zone out about things, it wasn't important. We weren't engaged. Or maybe we didn't, it's the end of the day on Thursday and we only have so much capacity. But then things go out of the center of the brain into that frontal lobe. And that's where our information is organized. So that's where we take information, we put it in schematic buckets, and that we then can plan a response. So those of you who have had teenage children or worked with teenage children, we know that their frontal lobes are not fully developed. That doesn't happen until about 25. And so that impulse control, that ability to like think through actions, make good choices, that's all in the frontal lobe. And none of that happens until everything else is processed. So then the UDL framework is built around these three things. So we have the three networks. So the recognition network is about representation, and then we have the guidelines for it are simply helping you to think through flexible ways to present what we teach and learn and what students learn. We then think about the strategic, the expression, how they're going to show what they know, and we want to make sure that they have flexible options. And then the affective strategies are focused on sustaining motivation and the why behind learning. So when you go to CAST and see these, the guidelines, they have, it's nice to have a couple different ways to present it, but this is the general organization. So you can see color coding between these three principles, and then you can see the guidelines going across. The way these guidelines are organized horizontally, it is talking about access. So that includes guidelines that suggest the way to increase access to the learning goals and to provide options. The second is build, and that includes guidelines to suggest ways to develop effort, persistence, language and symbols, and then expression and communication. And then finally, the last one is internalize. And so those are guidelines and ways to empower learners through self-regulation, comprehension, and executive functioning, which is something that our individuals with neurodiversity, autism, intellectual disability, learning disability, we have a tough time with executive functioning. And so within each of these, like little sub buckets to consider are recruiting interest, sustaining effort and persistence, self-regulation. So self-regulation is that ability to be cognizant of your current emotional and physical state and adjust your actions accordingly. We can then, the buckets go into perception, language and symbols, comprehension, and then physical access, expression, communication, and executive functioning. So this is normally where teachers get overwhelmed because it feels like so many things, but it's not. It doesn't mean that you have to have some like special fancy aspect for every single one of them, or that all of them are necessarily relevant. This is just kind of the universe of maybe categories of decisions or of factors that influence student learning and performance. So there are an identified 7 core skills for the world of work. And this is a little old. I'm going to move this here. It's a 2008 article. So it is, this is what this person identified as the skills that we need to make sure students and then adults in the workforce have in order to be successful. And so the 7 core skills are things like critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration across networks and leading by influence, agility and adaptability, initiative and entrepreneurialism, it's a hard one, effective oral and written communication, accessing and analyzing information, and then curiosity and imagination. So we're going to do something a little bit different in this webinar than we have done before, and that is I want to put you into breakout groups and have you start thinking about your adult learning students. So thinking about these 7 core areas, and I have some question prompts for you to think of, like, do you agree? Do you agree that these are the 7 core skills? Is there something you'd add or remove? Are there any of these that you find particularly challenging? Which of these do your students maybe have strengths in, and which students, what does it look like to have a strength in this area? And then which of these do you like regularly incorporate and support in your own instruction? So I'm going to stop screen sharing. And I'm also, Dave, do you mind pausing the recording? All right. So I hope that that was helpful. One to get to talk with each other. So getting feedback on that if you want the remaining two webinars to incorporate some more um, active engagement and in that way and being able to talk to each other. But I want to spend the last bit of our time together going through some specific strategies for each of those principles. And then I'm going to share a Google Drive folder with you that has some peer-reviewed articles. I know that unfortunately teachers don't always have access to those, but there's some practitioner-friendly like step-by-step articles for a variety of topics related to UDL. If this is something that you want to dive deeper into later or bookmark for a future time. So we're going to talk through the three principles. So the first one is multiple means of engagement. So engagement is not just a like dichotomous yes, no. My students are engaged or they're not engaged. There's actually these levels of student engagement. So we can have, our highly engaged learners. Out of this sampling of adults, we have some that are highly engaged. And what that definition is, it means that you're giving it high attention, but you also have a high commitment, right? So if you remember how we take information in our brains, we take things in. I need to be paying attention, right? Need to have high attention for that, but I also need to have high commitment. It also needs to, the why behind the learning needs to be clear. One of the things that is so difficult about teaching adults, about doing professional development with adults, is we are difficult and we only want to learn new things. And so we don't want time spent on things we already know, and we want everything to be immediately applicable. So we have those who are engaged, but then there can be just strategic compliance, right? So there might be some of us who are rule followers or who don't want to appear rude. So we are giving the high attention, right? But we don't have that commitment. We don't, the why behind the learning has not been activated. We go down a step from that, we have the ritual compliance. So I'm not really paying attention, I'm not really committed, but I am not, uh, I'm not causing a problem. And then there's retreatism, like I'm openly not paying attention and I don't care. And then there's outright rebellion. So like diverted attention, no commitment, distracting others, right? And so our goal is to work our way up sort of the ladder of engagement. But the thing that the advantage you do have when you're teaching adult learners is that we can use a lot of like think alouds and explaining our teaching strategies and why we're doing what we're doing. And we want to develop this metacognition and self-awareness. So we can have the students evaluate, like, where are you right now? No judgment, like you are where you are. It's like we feel how we feel, it's what we do with it. And then, okay, so what could we do to maybe increase your attention, increase your commitment? And that's where the UDL strategies come in. So the goal of multiple means of engagement is having these purposeful, motivated learners. So you can make sure that you're recruiting their interests. So how are we making sure that they care at all? So one way is to give choice and autonomy, right? So the perception of control and choice will increase engagement, making sure that what we're teaching, it's got an immediate relevance and value. Not everything is going to have like a real world application right away, but it might be a learning strategy they're going to need to be successful in a test, or it's core background knowledge they're going to need before a text is read. And then we need to make sure that we're minimizing threats and distractions. So distractions, that's the easiest to understand, right? It's the learning environment being disorganized, loud noises, too many transitions that aren't making sense. But threats have to do more with like a person's internal state. So we know, you have students who they want to answer every question, and they seek and thrive on that positive attention, positive reinforcement in front of peers. But then you have those who like, that is the worst thing you could do. Do not call me out. Do not have me, read out loud. There are those too. And so when we think about threats, that is where we need to know our individual students' preferences, their sort of nature, what do they find enjoyable, and to make sure that if we know there are things that make them really stressed, like working in a group, that we can. It doesn't mean that we never work in groups, right? That would be an example of we have the individual's competency and the environment, and like, oh, I'm just going to take away that demand. Well, no, we have to work in groups sometimes. Um, but it also isn't just like, oh well, you just need to get better at working in groups. We can do things like letting them know ahead of time, at maybe the beginning, giving them, we call that priming, or like a heads up, that we're going to be doing some group work today, and making it really clear what the order of the lesson's going to be. And if we know that that's a particular difficulty, we think about that being a skill that is difficult for someone. Can we make sure that's paired with maybe a content or a topic that's not difficult? Or can we make sure that they see, oh, it's only going to take place for this long and then it's going to be over? We also want to provide those options for them to maintain that effort and that persistence when learning is difficult. So making them understand the goals and objectives. Why are they doing what they're doing? And where are they in mastering, so that mastery oriented feedback. So it's not just a like, good job, good job, good job, which probably I hear that way more in K-12 classes and adult learning classes. But we want to make sure the feedback that we give them is meaningful, purposeful, behavior specific, like what was good that they did, and that we're reinforcing that specific thing. So that's also really important, because it means that we're reinforcing the action, the behavior, and not the person. So we're separating what you do from who you are. And then we want to build self-regulation. That is a skill that none of us can have too much of. And so that's where you want to promote. They have these expectations of knowing, like, I can, here's the things that I can do, and being aware of how they feel in the moment or what's going on, and being able to have some coping skills and some strategies for that. So being able to critically reflect on their social emotional state, because that influences learning. So you want to consider the components of engaging from the student's perspective. So how do they feel in your class? Do they have positive interpersonal relationships? Are they getting positive feedback? Does it facilitate active participation? And we'll get to in a minute, like in different ways. Not that participation is always raising our hand and calling on individual students, because then we only know about what that one person can do. We also want to think about, like, are they interested? Do they even care? How can we help them to care a little bit more? And one thing to do is to keep a brisk pace. So keeping things moving is going to help, especially those with attentional difficulties. You might think, oh, someone has trouble paying attention, I need to slow down. Like, no, that's actually not it. That'll make it worse. They need to know, is it important? Do I know what it is I'm supposed to be doing right now, and why? How do I know how this relates to something we've done before, and what is important to me afterwards? And then, like, do they even believe they can do it? Because if they're going into an activity or a skill and they don't even think it's possible, well, why would they be engaged or committed? So these are a couple of different ways to think about that variability. We want to anticipate and expect that there's going to be variability and engagement across students. So these are same strategies I've said already, but with some specific examples. So embedding routines for self-regulation, things like self-monitoring. I'll give an example of that in a minute. Also, directly teaching how to ask for help and how to give help, right? Because sometimes we might have other teachers or in the environment, or instructors who may have like some peer strategies where someone else is going to try to help them, and it's coming from a good place, but we need to teach how to ask for help and how to help someone and not just do for them. Okay, so then we're going to move into the second principle, which is multiple means of representation. So this is the what of learning. So thinking about the content. And so we want to, when we think about what it is that we're teaching, what are different ways that we can help students encounter that information? So one is, are there different ways to display it? This, can be based on a student's physical needs, for example, someone who has low vision, or a reading decoding disability. Is there a different way that we can display and show the information, and have some alternatives so that anything that is auditorily given, there is something written to match it. And similarly, if there's something written given, there's also an auditory component so that we are explaining as they are seeing. This, a way that I have seen this go wrong is by thinking, okay, my students need to take notes. Like, no, nope. Taking notes is a skill. It's something that is a learning skill that will, like taking notes from the board, that will help you maybe continue on higher ed. But if the student's outcome and the student's goal is not to continue necessarily in education, then note taking becomes a kind of useless skill, especially with the role of technology now. And so if you're explaining something to someone and it's written on the board and you want them to write it down, they cannot do all three of those things at once. And so that is going to be a threat to their engagement, because they feel overwhelmed, particularly if they have difficulties with writing. So options for language and symbols is related to making sure that they have the background knowledge to understand what it is that you're teaching. So are we explicitly teaching the vocabulary, making sure they have the content knowledge to understand it? I was working in a rural district in Georgia, and this was with middle school students, but I think this applies. So the standard, it was a math standard that talked about percent of change, and a natural context for percent of change problems is gratuity or sales tax or others. So the teacher said, my students, they know what like sales tax is loosely, but gratuity, and I thought she just meant the word. And I was like, well, we should teach gratuity means tip. And she's like, no, they've never been to a restaurant where you leave a tip. Or in a situation, they've only been to like a counter service place. So I was like, oh, yeah. So that's like a background knowledge that I just made assumptions that people knew, right? When they don't, and then that would make a problem not make a lot of sense. And then we want to have these options for comprehension to make sure that they are engaged and that they're able to kind of put that into like a mental schema or a bucket. So we activating and supplying background knowledge. The great thing about adults is they have a lot more background knowledge and experiences, and the diversity across the state of Florida means that those are, widely variable experiences. And so there's a wealth of lived experience and knowledge that they can share with each other. And that's important for everyone to feel like they do have something meaningful to contribute to the classroom. But that also means that sometimes there can be like misperceptions. And so we need to identify, elicit what the background knowledge is so we can correct it, if we need to. So some ways that we can anticipate variability are things like reducing that physical effort when possible. So if physically writing notes or writing responses on a worksheet is going to be difficult, either because they struggle with writing, conceptually or physically, I tell my teacher candidates that I want the worksheet to be the last option of what you consider. And we so often have this thought that there needs to be this permanent product, that they're writing things down, and that might not be the best way for someone to acquire or practice a new concept or skill. And then graphic organizers are a great way to help draw attention between the relationships. So maybe instead of, I'm writing a summary, can I fill in a graphic organizer that helps me to understand the pattern of nonfiction texts, of conflict resolution structure, of word problems. So especially in the area of math, math is my particular research area. This says all children, I would say all people are math language learners. And so math is a language, and there's vocabulary that they need to acquire. And so we need to explicitly teach what those words mean, especially if we have English language learners where the words, right can mean multiple things. And so we want to teach that mathematics terminology. And then really briefly, as I wrap up with the last principle, is that we want to vary the action expression, which just means how people show what they know. So we want to give different options for responding. This is where technology tools and assistive technology comes in. We want to give people an option for like how they show what they know. So maybe not everyone has to write or everyone has to give a speech. If our focus is on assessing their knowledge of content, then the skill, the way they demonstrate it, shouldn't matter. Similarly, if our goal is to develop a skill, like giving a speech, creating a PowerPoint presentation, then maybe they can have a lot more choice in the content that it's about. And then finally, executive functioning, and this is going to come back up in future webinars. We're going to really dive into executive functioning, but what that means is being able to execute skills in order to achieve a goal. So it requires knowing what your goal is, so appropriate goal setting, metacognition of being able to like be aware of where you are. Are your actions moving towards the goal or away from the goal? And how do you need to adjust? So I mentioned that self-monitoring is one strategy in goal setting. And so this is an example of that where it was within math, and we had students keep track of their performance, and then graph it. And so this can be done on paper with a graph or a line graph or a bar graph, but you can also set it up in something like Excel or Google Sheets, because once you create the formula, like for those cells, it populates forever. And so that's one way to make it really concrete, where they are in the learning process, what their goal is, and then that mastery-oriented feedback that you're providing them is helping them to move towards that goal. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I really appreciate everybody's attendance on this Thursday afternoon as we talk about UDL, and I look forward to talking with you all in February.
Thank you, Jenny. On behalf of ACE of Florida, I want to thank all of you for your participation in today's webinar. You will all be receiving an email later today, probably, containing a professional development documentation form, should you need one, and a link to a very brief webinar summary that we would appreciate you filling out. We use our feedback, your feedback, for future events. You can return the professional development form to me, Dave, at aceofflorida.org, and we'll send you a certificate documenting your participation. If you've attended sessions before or are going to attend sessions after this one, there are 2 more. You can lump them all on one or send them to me individually, whatever you like, whatever's easier for you, and we'll make sure you get your documentation. I want to remind you, as Jenny did, the 4th webinar in this 5-part series will be on Thursday, February 23rd from 3 to 4:30, and you'll be receiving some information about that as we go forward. So unless there's something else, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your week.